Brian Cordova sat alone in his office late into the night, the glow of his multiple monitors casting sharp shadows across the room. A half-empty cup of cold coffee rested beside his keyboard, untouched. Most CEOs would delegate this level of technical work, but Brian wasn't like most CEOs. Sentinel Cybersecurity Solutions was his creation, every line of code, every system safeguard, a testament to his hands-on approach. Tonight, however, something was different. Among the endless streams of data logs, one anomaly caught his eye. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, late-night logins from an IP address tied to the Cayman Islands. 3 a.m. logins, he muttered, typing rapidly to trace the source. The credentials belonged to Robbie Durham, his best friend since college and the head of Durham Developments, Sentinel's biggest client. At first, Brian dismissed it. Robbie often worked odd hours due to his frequent travel. But as he dug deeper, a pattern emerged. The same timestamps aligned with bursts of encrypted financial data moving through Durham Development's servers. A sharp knock broke his focus. Antoine Monroe, his head of security and a former NSA analyst, stepped into the room. "Sir," Antoine began, his voice calm but serious, "we've completed the analysis on Mrs. Cordova's devices." Brian's heart sank. This wasn't just about work. His wife, Carissa, had been acting strangely for months. Missed appointments, unusual spending, and stories that didn't quite add up had driven Brian to ask Antoine to investigate, a decision he now dreaded. Antoine hesitated before continuing. "There's a pattern. Every Wednesday and Sunday, like clockwork, her phone connects to a network labeled Durham Guesthouse. It's not Robbie's main residence. It's a luxury apartment in the Archer, downtown's most exclusive complex." Brian's grip tightened on his pen. "How long?" "6 months," Antoine replied. "But there's more. Remember the fertility clinic appointments Carissa mentioned?" Brian nodded. "She never once connected to the clinic's network. Instead, her phone's location data matches that same Archer address during those appointments." Antoine slid a tablet across the desk. Brian stared at the screen, his worst fears taking shape. "Pull everything you can find on that apartment, property records, utilities, surveillance footage. I want to know who owns it and who's been there." "Already on it," Antoine confirmed. As Antoine left, Brian turned back to his monitors. His hands moved automatically, gathering files, timestamps, and connections. His mind, however, was elsewhere, replaying every moment that now felt tainted, Carissa's laughter at family dinners, her sidelong glances at Robbie during events. The signs had always been there, he had just been too blind to see them. Brian hadn't slept much since discovering the suspicious logins and his wife's unexplained visits to the Archer building. His once orderly life felt like it was spinning out of control, but if there was one thing Brian excelled at, it was finding patterns in chaos. That morning, he sat in his office with Antoine, their work laid out on a digital map spanning 3 monitors. "This is the Archer apartment," Antoine explained, highlighting the location on the screen. "Property records show it's owned by a shell company. We traced the payments, guess where they're coming from?" "Durham Developments," Brian said through gritted teeth, already knowing the answer. Antoine nodded. "Robbie pays the rent quarterly, using an account under a subsidiary. The payments are disguised as consulting fees." Brian's fists clenched. "Anything else?" "Security footage," Antoine replied, pulling up video stills. "The Archer's private cameras don't retain footage for more than 48 hours, but their lobby is covered by city surveillance. Over the past month, Carissa and Robbie have both been recorded entering and exiting multiple times. Not together, but close enough to be suspicious." Brian stared at the images. Carissa's polished smile, Robbie's cocky swagger, they were both so casual, as if their deceit wasn't a betrayal but a routine. Antoine cleared his throat, hesitating. "There's one more thing. I ran a deeper scan on Sentinel's servers. Those late-night logins from Robbie's credentials? He's been siphoning off encrypted data." Brian's head snapped up. "What kind of data?" Client contracts, vendor lists, financial projections, Antoine explained. He's downloading the playbook for Sentinel's most sensitive business operations. Brian exhaled sharply, his mind racing. Robbie wasn't just a personal threat, he was an existential one to everything Brian had built. That afternoon, Brian decided to confront Carissa, not with accusations, but with questions. He found her in the sunroom, scrolling through her phone, a glass of wine in hand. "Busy day?" he asked casually, sitting across from her. Carissa smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Just catching up on emails." "You?" "Oh, you know, the usual," Brian replied, his tone light. Antoine found something interesting, though. Her fingers tightened slightly around the glass, but her expression didn't change. "Oh? What's that?" "Some unusual logins to Sentinel servers," Brian said, studying her closely. "From an IP link to the Caymans. Any idea why Robbie would need access to our client files?" Carissa froze, her smile faltering. "I wouldn't know." "That's between you and Robbie, isn't it?" "Maybe," Brian said, leaning back. "But it's strange, don't you think? Especially since he's been paying for that Archer apartment under a shell company. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Carissa's face flushed. "Brian, what are you getting at?" "I'm not getting at anything," Brian said coolly. "I'm just trying to make sense of some things that don't add up. Like why you've been at that apartment during your fertility appointments." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, she looked like she might deny it. But instead, she stood abruptly, setting her glass down with a sharp clink. "I don't have to listen to this," she snapped. Brian didn't stop her as she stormed out of the room. His heart was pounding, but he kept his composure. He had what he needed, a crack in her armor. That evening, Antoine called with another update. "I've analyzed the financial trails connected to the Archer apartment," Antoine said. "Robbie's shell company isn't just paying rent, it's funneling money out of Durham Developments. Millions of dollars. And get this, some of it is tied to investments your parents made with Robbie's firm." Brian's stomach churned. His parents had invested heavily with Robbie, trusting him with their retirement savings. If this was a scam, the fallout would devastate them. "Keep digging," Brian said, his voice cold. "And pull in Marcus from legal. I want every angle of this covered before I make my move." "Yes, sir," Antoine replied. As Brian hung up, he stared at the darkened window, his reflection staring back at him. Robbie and Carissa had underestimated him. But they were about to learn just how dangerous it was to betray Brian Cordova. Brian sat in the dim light of his office, the hum of his monitors providing a steady backdrop to his thoughts. The evidence was mounting: Carissa's visits to the Archer apartment, Robbie's suspicious logins, and now the financial trail linking his parents' investments to potential fraud. The betrayal was personal, but the stakes were far larger than his marriage. Antoine stepped into the room, carrying a folder. "We've got the full picture," he said, setting the folder on the desk. Brian opened it, his sharp eyes scanning the pages. Inside were detailed financial records showing how Robbie had funneled money from Durham Developments into shell accounts, disguising embezzlement as consulting fees. There was even evidence suggesting Robbie had been using Brian's own parents as unwitting investors in a Ponzi scheme. "It's worse than I thought," Brian muttered. "He's not just stealing from me, he's using my family as pawns." Antoine nodded grimly. "What's the plan, sir? Do you want to take this to the authorities now?" "Not yet," Brian replied, leaning back in his chair. "If we act too soon, they'll scatter. I want to catch Robbie and Carissa red-handed, with no way to deny it. We'll set a trap." Over the next week, Brian worked with Antoine, his legal team, and a forensic accountant named Erica to build an airtight case. Erica uncovered that Robbie had been hosting private investor meetings, promising astronomical returns on investments that were little more than vapor. "If we can tie him to those meetings and prove fraud," Erica explained during a late-night conference call, "we'll have everything we need for prosecution. But we need something concrete, something in real time." I have an idea, Brian said. Robbie's throwing that big engagement party next weekend, right? I'll make sure it's his last hurrah. Antoine raised an eyebrow. How? Brian's lips curled into a determined smile. We'll give him enough rope to hang himself. I want surveillance set up at the venue. Audio, video, the works. If he so much as whispers about his scheme, we'll catch it. The following day, Brian texted Robbie, feigning normalcy. Hey, heard about the party. Can't wait to celebrate with you. Let me know if you need anything. The response came quickly, you're the man, Brian. Bring Carissa, too. It's going to be epic. Brian stared at the screen, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. Robbie's arrogance was staggering. He still thought he'd gotten away with everything. That evening, Brian found Carissa in their bedroom, packing for what she claimed was a girls' weekend. Change of plans, Brian said, leaning against the doorframe. We're going to Robbie's engagement party instead. Carissa froze, her hands hovering over her suitcase. I didn't know you wanted to go, she said, forcing a smile. Oh, I wouldn't miss it, Brian replied smoothly. It'll be good to catch up with Robbie. You've been seeing him so often these days, it's about time I joined the fun. Her face flushed, and she quickly turned back to her suitcase. Fine. If that's what you want. It is, Brian said, his tone leaving no room for argument. As the party approached, Antoine and Erica coordinated with law enforcement to ensure everything was in place. The venue, a sprawling estate Robbie had rented, was rigged with discreet surveillance devices. Plainclothes officers mingled with the crowd, ready to act at a moment's notice. This has to go perfectly, Brian told Antoine the night before the event. If we miss even one detail, he'll wriggle out of it. We've got this, Antoine assured him. By the end of tomorrow, Robbie will have nowhere to hide. The evening of the engagement party was a spectacle of wealth and excess. The sprawling estate was lit up like a movie set, with guests in designer attire mingling under chandeliers strung across the gardens. Brian and Carissa arrived together, the tension between them masked by forced smiles. Carissa stepped out of the car, her elegant dress shimmering under the lights. Brian offered her his arm, his expression unreadable. Shall we? He said, his tone as neutral as ever. She hesitated before looping her arm through his. Let's get this over with. Brian's lips twitched in a faint, knowing smile. Oh, it's far from over, he thought. Inside, Brian spotted Robbie holding court near the grand staircase, a glass of champagne in hand. His fiancée, a stunning woman who looked barely old enough to drink, clung to his arm, laughing at something he'd said. Brian's gaze hardened as he approached. Robbie, he said, extending a hand. Brian. Robbie beamed, pulling him into a half-hug. Glad you could make it. And Carissa, you look stunning, as always. Carissa forced a smile, her grip tightening on Brian's arm. I wouldn't miss it for the world, Brian replied, his tone cool. Big night for you, huh? Robbie smirked. The start of something huge. Speaking of which, I've got a few investors here tonight you should meet. People who really understand the big picture. Brian's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. I'd love that. Introduce me later. Robbie nodded enthusiastically before being pulled away by another guest. As the night wore on, Brian observed Robbie closely. True to form, Robbie was making his rounds, charming a select group of investors in quiet corners of the estate. Antoine had discreetly positioned surveillance equipment in those areas, ensuring every word was captured. At one point, Brian followed Robbie to a private room where a group of men in suits had gathered. Robbie's demeanor shifted, gone was the charming host, replaced by a calculated businessman. You've all seen the numbers, Robbie said, his voice smooth but firm. This next round of investments is where the real money is. Get in now, and you'll double your returns by the end of the quarter. One of the men hesitated. But the last payout hasn't come through yet. Can you explain that? Robbie laughed, clapping the man on the shoulder. That's just bureaucracy slowing things down. Trust me, the money's there. You've got my word. From his position just outside the room, Brian's blood boiled. Robbie's word meant nothing, and soon, everyone in that room would know it. At midnight, as the party reached its peak, Brian signaled Antoine. Within moments, plainclothes officers began quietly moving into position. Robbie was on the main terrace, raising his glass and a toast. To new beginnings, he declared, his voice carrying over the crowd. To new beginnings, the guests echoed. But the applause was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. FBI agents, led by Antoine, stepped onto the terrace. The crowd fell silent as the agents approached Robbie. "Robbie Durham," the lead agent said, his voice clear and authoritative. "You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy." Robbie's face twisted in shock. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, stepping back. The agent ignored him, reading his rights as officers moved in to cuff him. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Carissa, standing near the edge of the terrace, looked pale and panicked. She caught Brian's eye, but his expression offered no comfort, only cold satisfaction. As the chaos unfolded, Brian approached Carissa. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" he asked, his voice low but cutting. Tears welled in her eyes. "Brian, Save it," he interrupted. "You've lied to me for months. You've betrayed our marriage, our family. And for what? To help him?" Carissa shook her head, her voice trembling. "It wasn't like that. I didn't know what he was really doing." Brian's laugh was bitter. "You didn't know? You were at his apartment every week. You helped him cover his tracks. Don't insult me by pretending you were innocent." She reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "We're done, Carissa," he said firmly. "I don't need your excuses. I need you gone." As Robbie was led away in handcuffs, and Carissa stood alone in the crowd, Brian felt a strange sense of relief. The betrayal had been devastating, but now, the path forward was clear. Antoine approached him, his expression grim but satisfied. "We got everything," he said. "The recordings, the documents. Robbie won't be able to talk his way out of this." Brian nodded, his gaze steady. "Good. Let's make sure he pays for every bit of damage he's done." The day after the party, Brian sat in his office, the weight of the previous night pressing heavily on him. The headlines were already spreading like wildfire: business mogul Robbie Durham arrested in high-stakes fraud scandal. His phone buzzed nonstop with calls and texts from colleagues, reporters, and even distant relatives, all wanting to know what had happened. But Brian wasn't ready to talk. He had more pressing matters to deal with. Antoine entered the office, a stack of files in hand. "FBI's wrapping up their case," he said. "They'll be freezing Durham Development's assets by the end of the week. But there's another issue we need to address: your parents' investments." Brian frowned. "How bad is it?" Antoine sighed. "Bad. Your parents' retirement funds were funneled into Robbie's shell companies. If the money can't be recovered, they'll lose almost everything." Brian's hands balled into fists. "He used them," he muttered. "He knew they trusted him, and he exploited it." "We're working with the forensic accountants," Antoine assured him. "There's a chance we can recover some of it. But it'll take time." Brian nodded, his jaw tight. "Do whatever it takes. I'll cover the difference if I have to, but my parents won't lose their future because of him." That evening, Brian returned home to find Carissa waiting for him in the living room. Her suitcase sat by the door, and her eyes were red from crying. "I know you don't want to see me," she began, her voice trembling. "But I wanted to say goodbye. And to tell you. I'm sorry." Brian stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Sorry for what, Carissa? For lying to me? For betraying me with my best friend? Or for helping him steal from my family?" She flinched at his words, but she didn't look away. "For all of it," she said quietly. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I wanted you to know that I regret everything. Brian shook his head, his voice cold. Regret doesn't erase the damage you've done. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed everything we built together. And for what? A man who's now sitting in a jail cell. Tears streamed down her face. I made mistakes. Huge mistakes. But I loved you, Brian. I still do. If this is love, Brian said sharply, I want no part of it. Carissa nodded, swallowing hard. I understand. I'll leave. But for what it's worth, I hope you find happiness again. You deserve it. Without another word, she picked up her suitcase and walked out the door. The next morning, Brian met with his parents to explain everything. His mother, Judith, looked devastated as he laid out the details of Robbie's scheme. I trusted him, Judith said, her voice shaking. We've known him since you were in college. How could he do this to us? Brian placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. He's a con artist, Mom. He knew how to manipulate people, especially people like us, who believed in him. But I'm going to make this right. I promise. His father, Harold, remained silent, his face a mask of disappointment and anger. Finally, he said, this isn't your fault, Brian. None of this is. But thank you for stepping in when you did. We would have lost everything if you hadn't. Brian nodded, his resolve hardening. I won't let him get away with it. Not 1 cent. Over the next few weeks, Brian threw himself into damage control. With the help of his team, he worked tirelessly to secure his parents' financial future and reassure Sentinel's clients that their data and their trust were safe. Robbie's trial loomed on the horizon, with prosecutors building a case that would ensure he faced the full weight of the law. As for Carissa, Brian heard little from her. She had moved out of state, leaving behind only a note apologizing once more and asking for a chance to rebuild her life. Brian didn't respond. But despite everything, Brian began to feel a glimmer of hope. The betrayal had nearly destroyed him, but it had also reminded him of his strength and the importance of the people who truly had his back. Months passed, and the chaos that had engulfed Brian's life began to subside. The headlines about Robbie's fraud faded, replaced by new scandals and distractions. But for Brian, the aftermath was a daily reality. Sentinel Cybersecurity Solutions weathered the storm, largely thanks to Brian's swift action to secure client trust. He implemented stricter safeguards, ensuring no one could ever exploit his systems the way Robbie had. The business grew stronger, a testament to Brian's resilience and leadership. At home, the silence was heavier. Without Carissa, the house felt hollow, but it also gave Brian a sense of peace. He no longer had to question every glance, every excuse, every missing hour. Robbie's trial was a spectacle, with prosecutors laying out the full extent of his crimes. Witness after witness testified to his charm, his manipulation, and the financial devastation he left in his wake. Brian took the stand, his testimony damning. He detailed Robbie's use of Sentinel's data, the fraudulent schemes, and the personal betrayal that fueled his determination to see justice served. When the verdict came, it was swift, guilty on all counts. Robbie was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, his once glamorous life reduced to a cautionary tale. One evening, as Brian sorted through old files, he found a forgotten photo album. Inside were pictures of him and Robbie during their college days, laughing over beers and celebrating early successes. There were photos of Carissa, too, her radiant smile a reminder of happier times. For a moment, Brian felt a pang of grief, not for what he had lost, but for the people he thought they were. He closed the album and set it aside. Brian decided to channel his experiences into something meaningful. He launched a new division within Sentinel, focused on uncovering financial fraud and helping victims recover their losses. His first project? A pro bono effort to help retirees like his parents rebuild after falling prey to scams. The Archer Building, once a symbol of betrayal, became the headquarters for this initiative. Brian turned the penthouse apartment Robbie had rented into a workspace for his new fraud prevention team. 1 year after the engagement party, Brian stood on the balcony of his renovated office, overlooking the city skyline. Antoine joined him, holding 2 glasses of champagne. To survival, Antoine said, raising his glass. Brian smiled faintly, clinking glasses. To rebuilding. As he sipped the champagne, Brian felt a sense of closure. The betrayal had left scars, but it hadn't broken him. If anything, it had made him stronger, more determined to protect what mattered. Brian eventually allowed himself to open up to new possibilities. He met someone honest, grounded, and patient enough to help him rediscover trust. Their relationship was slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to the whirlwind romance he'd once shared with Carissa. The past was behind him now, but the lessons remained. In the end, Brian learned that betrayal, no matter how painful, didn't have to define him. It could be the foundation for something stronger, something unshakable. And as he looked out over the city that had witnessed his rise, his fall, and his resurgence, Brian knew that he was ready for whatever came next.